Well, we're coming towards the end of our series, God's Story, and we've spent the last few weeks going through Genesis. And today, if the last few weeks have been a on-the-ground walkthrough of each story, today we're going to jump into an aeroplane and we're going to fly very, very high, and we're going to basically go through most of the Bible. If we had a few years, you'd probably go story at a time, but unfortunately, next week is Easter. And fortunately, next week is Easter. So we want to get to the stories, we want to build it up so that next week we're able to celebrate the life of Jesus, his death and his resurrection. So where have we been so far? We started within the beginning. We started in Genesis 1 looking at this thing that God created everything that we have in our world. He brought order out of chaos, and he just brought humanity into this relationship with him and said, I want to be with you and let's do this together. Then we had a look at the story between Adam, Eve, and the serpent, and it turned out that humanity was unable to live in that vision that God had given them. And humanity, instead of trusting that God had their best interest at heart, and instead of submitting to his ultimate authority, humanity said, I think I can do this better. I think I want something more. And the whole battle ever since that incident, the whole battle has been humanity wanting to have the world as we see it. But the way that we see it ends up benefiting who? Me. And when we live in a way where we're trying to benefit only ourselves, the people who suffer are others. And God's trying to get in there and say, if you live under my authority, if you live in the way that I've planned it, if you listen to the rules that I have, then we can live in a way which is sustainable, loving, kind. And that might mean that you don't get what you ultimately want the way you perceive it. But I'll give you so much better than that. I'll give you community. I'll give you a relationship which will sustain you no matter what is happening. And humanity has been battling that ever since. And so we're in a situation currently where we look at Genesis 1 and we know that that's not the story. We look at Genesis 3 and we look at the fall and we look at this thing of original sin and however you want to look at it, and we go, yeah, that makes sense. The world is not how it should be like it's portrayed in Genesis 1. So the fact that something deviated, I can see that in the way that I live and the way the world is and the pain that I've suffered and the things that I've been through. But then we see in the Bible that God then has extended a way back to him. And we saw it last week when we looked at the story of Abram, where God said, you may be living to a vision that you want to see happen, and I'm trying to bring you back to this vision. And I tried the whole, let's just wipe and start again. They tried that with Noah, but what happened? Didn't work. And so do you see God reaching out and saying, let's do this relationally. I'm going to bring you and draw you back into me through relationship. And so with the promise to Abram, who then becomes Abraham later on, we see the trajectory of the Bible start to take shape as God calls his people back to himself. And today we're going to go through, and it's going to be a bit of a marathon of stories and events that are going to lead us to the place of seeing why we need Jesus and why we need him to step in on our behalf. So let's start here. Who loves rules? Now, there's some of you, and you're probably not going to raise your hands, there's some of you that when you have the rules, it's pretty nice. You want to step into a space and you want to, if you go to McDonald's, you see the playground, it's got the rules, or we went roller skating on Friday night at youth, you go in and they've got all the rules there. For some of us, we look and we're like, look at those silly things, and we walk in confidently to what's happening. Some of you guys walk in and go, yep, oh, excuse me. Number 4, I just want to clarify something. And that's great. Bless you. That's awesome. We need you. That's definitely not my experience. When I see rules, the first thing I think is, what is it trying to stop me from doing? I want to have some fun. And there is some numbers with some words next to it. And I'm just trying to clarify. And if anything, when I get to a rule where I see there needs to be, where there's a bit of uncertainty, my tendency is actually to go, oh, look at that leeway they've given me. They should have clarified that with a sub-rule. And some of you are like, no, we need to get this down and make sure it works. But at the end of the day, even for those of us who love rules, even for those of you who love it, we like them until they what? Until they're against us. I love a good rule when it puts that thing in order. I love a good rule when it makes sure that that person behaves. I love a good rule when it makes sense of the situation. But I don't like it when it tells me what to do. Because I know what's best. I've got a good head on my shoulders, and I know the rule says that, but if it just trusted me, I could step out and lead this better. I could do this better. And at the end of the day, no matter how much we love rules or how much we hate them, we can never follow them perfectly. We can sustain it for a short period of time, but give ourselves enough years, give ourselves enough conversation, give ourselves enough friendships and contexts, and we will break a rule or two. Sometimes well-meaning. Sometimes rules need to be broken because they actually do not speak for the best of humanity. But sometimes we break rules just because how do we keep it perfect all the time? And so when we look at the story of the Bible, especially as we journey through the Old Testament, what we're going to see is that God creates a relationship with his people. But part of living within that relationship, not part of getting into the relationship. When God called his people, it was a relational calling. When he then said, this is how you ought to live, and he gave the rules, it was not, you ought to live this way so that you can be in relationship with me. He said, we are in relationship. Now, to live well in this relationship, you must follow these rules. So we're just got to make sure there's that distinction, because you don't want to get caught thinking that you can earn your way into a relationship with God. If I'm just better, if I can just do more, if I can just stop that habit, if I can just make sure my thinking is always correct. You can't earn your way into a relationship with God. If anything, what we see through the Gospels and what we see through the Old Testament is that humanity, no matter how good we behave, no matter how much we try to follow the rules, ultimately we can't follow the rules. Because you may get it right 99.9% of the time. But when God stands there in his holiness, his goodness, his greatness, and in his justice, God says, I need 100%. And you can go and say, but I got 99.9. And God will say, but there's still that 0.1. And that's where Jesus steps in. That's where Jesus comes into the mix. And we'll get to Jesus in just a little bit. So let's have a look at the story of the Old Testament. So we finished up last week with Abram. If you've got your Bibles, we are going to land in John 18, but we're going to get to that in just a little while. We're just going to go in a flyover through the Old Testament now. We started with Abram, God calling out and calling a people to himself. After Abram, we find out as we unpack his story of his life, he does some things not exactly perfect. One thing which I find sort of funny or weird is that he lies about his wife. So him and his wife are traveling and they come to a foreign land and they say, can we stay here? And the king says yes. And as they're staying there, the king notices, your wife is very attractive. Now, the king doesn't know it's his wife. And to protect himself, because Abram was a little bit afraid, he said, that's not my wife, it's my sister. And so the king goes, takes her away and says, all right, you can become my wife. And what's happened? And then God ends up stepping in because Abram can't quite own up to it. And then he gets his wife back. They move on. Not a great story. Very awkward one. Like, I don't know, for those of you who are married, like rocking up and being like, this is my sister. I don't know, just weird. Then he does it again. And then you want to know about intergenerational trauma, intergenerational stuff. Then what does Isaac do? So Abram has sons and one of them is Isaac. What does he do? He lies about his wife. It's like, what is this show? Anyway. Then Isaac goes along. His life it has its high points. It has its low points. And then he eventually has two sons, Jacob and Esau. And then Jacob gets the blessing and he's a little bit tricky. And then Jacob has 12 sons. And one of them is Joseph. And we know a lot about Joseph. So a quick flyover of Joseph's life. Joseph heard from God that he is someone who is special. That's great. He then went up to his brothers and thought he would be the one to announce his specialness to them. And they already saw how favored he was and that he was the favorite one. So they looked at him and they heard this news and didn't respond well. So they threw him into a pit. And like, whoa, let's not kill him. Let's sell him. They sold him. He went into Egypt. He eventually worked his way up the ranks. He became a very powerful person. And then one day he's there, and the wife of the person he's working for says, "Hey, do you want to come and sleep with me?" And he says no. She lies. He ends up in jail. While he's in jail, he had a couple of visions, one of them good, one of them not so good. You can read about that in your own time. And then eventually, he becomes so powerful, he becomes second in charge to Pharaoh, which is just this amazing redemption story. And he says to his family, "Come over here and come and hang out with me." Now, the brothers are extremely cautious. They were the ones that set him on this path. They were the ones that wanted to kill him. Then they wanted to sell him on. They sold him on. And Joseph's there. His life has some high points. It has some low points. But in the story, he brings his family into Egypt. And they come across. So now, why did the family come over? Because if we remember back to Abram, what I talked about last week, land is a big deal. So why is it that Jacob thought it would be wise to bring his family out of the land that God had promised them into Egypt? Well, if you look within the story, it says that he goes to God, and basically God says, "You have my blessing, you can go." So he says, "I'll be with you." So they go in there. Eventually Jacob dies. The brothers become very worried. Protection is gone. That brother, who could be plotting for all we know, may kill us. And Joseph says, "No, we're cool. Let's get on with it." Now, about 200 years pass, and there's a transition that happens in the story where this tribe that had come in to live amongst the Egyptians had now become more and more powerful. Joseph had passed away, and the Pharaoh looked around and said, "Uh-oh, there's a lot of them. They're very, very gaining influence here." And so he put them into slavery and started to oppress the people who were called by God to be a light into the world. They're there now in Egypt, slaving away. And then we get the story of Moses. God calls up Moses. Moses boldly steps forward and says, "Send somebody else." God says, "No, you." And he says, "Please, somebody else." And says, "All right, I'll give you Aaron. He can speak and you can go and do some tricks on the side." And then Moses is there and he's leading his people out of Egypt towards the promised land. And it's within the story context of Moses and then eventually when they transition to Joshua that we see some things shift in the story. Now, this is very big picture, so obviously I'm skipping over a lot of stuff. But within the story from Moses to Joshua, this transition of leadership, the law is given. There's the conquering of the land. The people are known by the people around them. They are the people of one God. And not only are they the people of one God, but they're the people of one God for which there is no image. There's a story, I can't remember, I'm going to get these facts wrong, but just the gist of it is this. A conquering king came in and wanted to look at this God that was held within the temple. So he came through, slaughtered a bunch of people, got to the Holy of Holies, which is the center part, which contains the God, because their thinking at the time is God's in the temple. And this king wanted to see what this God looked like, because every other God at the time has an image. And this king came and he conquered and he went into the Holy of Holies and they ripped it open. And what did they find? No image. Because it's a God without an image. What happened when Moses and they left Egypt? And one of the first things they did while Moses is off trying to figure out from God what's next, they started to make an image. And I don't blame them for doing that, because they live in a context where to have a God or to know God is to know an image. And we do it in our own little funny ways where we try to define God and we try to put him in an image form that we can understand and comprehend. But God is saying that that is not who I am. You cannot define me in an image that is here on earth. I'm too big. There's too much of me for that. So they became the people of one God. But unfortunately, they kept getting distracted and they kept forgetting that. And then we came to the cycle of the judges. So the people are out of Egypt. They've wandered the land, wandered around for 40 years on one heck of a side trip. They want to go from A to B, and they went A, B, C, D, and then they eventually got back to where they were meant to be. And then once they're there, there's a cycle that begins to happen with the people of God. And we call it the Judges cycle, and it happens in the book of Judges. So a judge was somebody who God raised up to bring peace or bring justice back to the people so that they could be freed to worship God as God wanted them to. And the cycle looks like this. Israel is serving God. Tick. They disobey God. Untick. Then they become enslaved, maybe physically or maybe through through the way they live, they become disobedient and they follow other gods. They become enslaved physically or just as a culture. They cry out to God, "We are trapped, and you said you will be with us." So what does God do? Raises up a judge. The judge goes, helps free the people, gets them back to serving God, and then the cycle starts again. And so as you go through the book of Judges and as you see the different, that's where we get the story of Samson and that from. As you go through there, you start to see the cycle where these people who are meant to be following God disobey, are enslaved, get freed because God raises somebody up. They serve God for a time, and then they forget. And in fact, the last words in the book, which is very telling. The last words in the book of Judges says, "There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eye." There are people who are meant to be following this God, who is meant to be without image, who is meant to be one that was formed, something that was formed in relationship, and they just ended up doing what they thought was right. So then, the people of Israel look around and they notice that everybody else has a king, and they start to go, "Why don't we have a king? A king seems pretty cool. We should get a king." Then the people, because they are struggling with this invisible God, they want a king just like the other nations to physically represent them. So they go to Samuel, the prophet, and say, "We want a king." Samuel goes and talks to God, and he goes back to the people and he says, "You know what kings do? Kings go to war. Kings fight for what's theirs. Kings can lord it over people. You want to be like the other nations, but look at how the other nations' kings treat them." And the people say, "We want a king." Samuel goes back to God and says they really want a king. And God says, "Okay, give them a king, but they're warned. They know what's going to happen." And then the story from there is just this up and down battle of a nation trying to follow God. But they have good kings and they have bad kings. There's device, there's division, there's things that are happening in the nation that God didn't want to see happen. But this is where they've landed. So what do we learn? That's basically the story of the Old Testament. Now then there's prophets in there and some other stuff happening. Don't have time for that today. But what do we learn from this story movement from Abram? The promise to an individual that I will gather my people again. And it shifts through to a point where you've got a nation that have been through so much, and now they're being led by kings and they're trying to figure out their identity. What do we learn from this saga? I think the first thing that we learn is this, that following rules or living to a standard is hard. The people of God were given a way to live, which was not like everything else. So when they went and they looked at the rules God had given them, they didn't have another nation to go and compare notes with. And in fact, they were meant to be the nation that other nations came to and said, "I like what you're doing, what's up?" But that's not what happened. They found that living to that standard is just hard. And they maintained it for pockets, but they couldn't maintain it for long stretches of time. And it's just like you and me in our daily life, in our weekly life, in our monthly and yearly life. We can maintain a standard of living, but then we have a bad day. We have a relationship that ends. We have a time of crisis. Something happens, and suddenly living to that standard, it just isn't possible anymore. But we see that through the history of the biblical story. And we know that just from life. It's hard to obey rules because not obeying them seems so much more fun. The second thing we learn is this, that God is faithful, and this is evident in his continual restoration and discipline of Israel. God is faithful to Israel again and again and again and again and again and again. He continually restores them back to a status of saying, that has been, but let's start again. And he does that again and again and again. And we see God's faithfulness even when the people don't want to know about him. Even when the people operate in a way and they go, I want to do it my way. I don't want to live like my ancestors did listening to God. I want to do it in my own strength. And God reminds them of his love. God is faithful, and it's evident by the way he continually restores and disciplines Israel. The third thing that we learn, I think, is that you and I need a physical representation of the reality that we need to embrace. We cannot make a physical representation of God. That's not what I'm saying. But we do need somebody who embodies what following Jesus looks like. And we need them in our lives because there's times when what we read and what we feel doesn't align with what God wants. Or how we're understanding our faith is unclear or a little bit uncertain. And it's in those moments and those times that we need somebody in our lives who represents Jesus to us. That person of faith who journeys with us through the dark times. That person of faith who's there to offer a prayer, a hug, a piece of scripture, a word of encouragement. Someone who can be with us when we don't see God clearly. We need that in our life. You and I need a physical representation of the reality we need to embrace. And then when another person is going through a tough time, we become that for them. We have enough strength and enough clarity to be able to support somebody else. And the fourth thing we learn is this: we can never sustain an in-sync relationship with God 100% of the time. But he knows that. And he is still with us. So a couple of times in the story, God does leave his people. It talks about God moving out. It talks about God moving away. But for a majority of the time, they were doing things which were really, really bad. But for a majority of the time, even when Israel are disobedient, even when the Jewish people are not following like they should, God is with them. He's still present with them, even though the people are not 100% with him in the way they're acting and in what they are doing. So let's have a look at John chapter 18. And let's have a look at an example here about what we are to do when we mess up and when we don't quite follow the rules. So in this passage, part of the passage, Jesus has been arrested. He's gone on trial, and they've decided this guy, it's the end of the road for him. Jesus has been arrested. His disciples were with him. He was talking about some stuff which they need to do. They were a bit unsure, and now he's gone, and there's a bit of panic and a bit of uncertainty. And here we have John 18, verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus. So Jesus has been led away, and so did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Jesus has been led away. Peter is following, so is another disciple. The other disciple is a friend, so he can get in, but Peter has to wait outside. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let him in. Awesome. Great to have connections and friends, hey? It's a good lesson. The woman asked Peter, "You're not one of the man's disciples, are you?" And what does he say? No. No, I'm not. Because it was cold, the household servants and guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. Could you imagine how Peter would have felt in that moment? This guy spent 3 years following Jesus. He's seen miracles. He's seen people brought back from the dead. He's seen food multiplied. He's seen teaching, which is unrivaled any other teacher. He's experienced not just the teaching, but he's seen the life that actually supports it. And he's seen Jesus be Jesus. And he's been following him for 3 years. And now Jesus has been taken away, and he's standing there and he's asked, "Do you know him?" And what is the answer? No. What should the answer have been? Yes, I know him. I've been journeying with him. I could tell you a few stories that you would not believe. And he says, no. Go on to verse 25. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire, warming himself. Now, he would have felt rubbish, I imagine. You'd hope so. One, he's feeling uncertain about what's happening with Jesus, but also he's betrayed his own integrity. And he's standing there by the fire, warming himself. Verse 25. And they asked him again. So I don't know how much time has lapsed, but you know when you know someone and you're trying to figure it out for a few seconds? Just yesterday, I went out for a dad-daughter date with Azalia, and we went out and we had a milkshake and we had a great time there. And then we went to the shop because she wanted to buy a Marnella necklace. I said, okay, let's go. They've got a sale on. Let's go in there. And there's somebody standing in the shop, and I'm looking at them, and I'm like, I know you. But it's that awkward thing of like, I don't know from where. And you can do the, hi, nice to see you. Yeah, we know each other. You could do that. Or I just sort of stayed back and said, I'm not going to engage. I can see the face. We've talked. I know we've talked. And I know what it was about, but I can't remember who you are. So I just sort of stood back. And then she came up to me and said, I saw you at the open day at Hillside. You were with the animals because I helped do the animal tickets for kids to go and pat little bunnies and that. I'm like, yes, that's where I know you from. You were the lady that was concerned about the rabbit's welfare, and we moved it out of the sun. And anyway, we had a little chat. But, you know, there's a few moments there where I'm looking at her like, I know you. And she looked at me and you did the sort of, we know we saw each other and we're trying to figure each other out. But then I had my Hillside bag and she connected the dots and away went. Anyway, they're standing around the fire. They're looking at him. We know you. We know you. You're not one of his disciples, are you? Because we've seen you. We've seen you before. He denied it again, saying, no, I'm not. Wrong person. Mistaken identity. Not me. But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative, now this is even more awkward, a relative of the man for whose ear Peter had cut off. Whew. I can understand why he doesn't want to be recognized. You cut off my cousin's ear, didn't you? Awkward times. Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus? And again, Peter denied it. And then what happened after he denied it the third time? A rooster crowed. Now, Jesus had predicted this was going to happen. And what did Peter say at the time when Jesus predicted it? He said, no, not me. Wherever you go, Lord, I will go. Wherever you stand, I'll be next to you. Whatever is happening, I will not leave you. And he denies Jesus. Not once, not twice, but thrice. So you want to talk about living to a standard. He just had to say he was with him. There was no rule around what he did or didn't have to say here. There's no rule that said, thou shalt not deny me. Be really good forward thinking if there was. There was no rule here. All he had to do was just say, I know him. The standard was really simple. Be a person of integrity whose word is clear and whose word is true. And here he is. No, no, no. But luckily, that's not the end of the story. Jesus is crucified, and we'll look at that next week. And he comes back to life. Yes, which is awesome. Then he has a chat to Peter. 21 verse 15 if you want to go there. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these, or more than others do? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs. Then Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said. You know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. And then a third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And now I don't know what Peter's thinking, but he must be like, I don't know, this resurrection's really scrambled your brains a bit. You've already asked me twice. Yes, I love you. Ask me again and again, I love you. It says Peter was hurt that he had to ask the question a third time. Then feed my sheep. Verse 18, I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself, you went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you to where you do not want to go. This is talking about how he's going to die. Jesus said this to let them know what kind of death he would have. And then the final word Jesus says at this point, or where we're going to stop anyway, Jesus says, follow me. This here is a moment of restoration. Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus asked 3 times, do you love me? And what's amazing to me is that there's this man who clearly under pressure did not do the task he was meant to do. And what does Jesus do? He gives him the keys to the church. He says, here, lead my people, man. He saw him, didn't see him, he was inside, Peter was outside, but he knew that Peter was out there denying him. Just think on a friendship level how much that would have hurt. He's under physical pain, he's under all this duress, and these people who he's been journeying with, who he loves, is out there. One of them is out there denying that he even knows him. And then Jesus restores him and says, you're going to lead this thing, buddy. And it's just incredible. And what I love there at the end there is Jesus just says to him, follow me. Learn from me. Become like me. Grow in the fruit of the Spirit. Follow my commands. Put off the expectations of this world, Peter. Take on the expectations of my Father's kingdom, which is to love and lead my people. Love others, not in word, not in deed, but in deed. Cast your cares onto me. And what I take from everything we've looked at through the Old Testament and what I see in the life of Peter here in this moment, what I see is that at the end of the day, no matter how good you and I are, we can never do it in our own strength. We can never meet the mark. Jesus came to earth and he lived in a way that you and I never could. When God gave the 10 Commandments and when he journeyed with his people, there was a standard that was set, but they could never reach it. And so God interacted on our behalf. He came in and he actually said, I know you can never do it. I'm going to do it for you. And Jesus stepped in and he lived up to the mark. And then when he comes across people who didn't hit the mark, as we see with Peter, someone who was meant to be close to Jesus, who was meant to emulate him, who should have known the right thing to do in that moment, even then he was unable to do what was needed to be done. And Jesus says, follow me. Follow me. We can't do it in our strength, our own strength. You and I can never live up to the holiness of God, the standard that God demands. We can never fulfill every rule or follow the role perfectly. But when we put our trust in him, when we walk with him daily, he will fill in the gaps. And we won't be people who have to live to get it right. We don't have to be people who live, who try, who fail and try again. But instead, we get to join in with those that live humbly knowing we could never do it on our own. And it's only because of Jesus that we are able to live the lives that we do. Because there is a big gap in how our lives look in reality and the standard of God's perfection and holiness. And no matter how much we do, learn, grovel, we can't ever hit that gap. It's always out of reach. But when we trust in Jesus, when we put our faith in him and when we follow him, he stands in that gap and allows us to be restored to our Heavenly Father. And you know what happens out of that? Our lives change. We become more loving, more kind, and more free. We display the fruit of the Spirit. We grow in goodness, self-control, goodness. We grow in those things. They become a part of who we are. We didn't get that so that we could earn the relationship. We follow Jesus, and it is a thing that grows out of the relationship. And if we ever get those flipped around, that's when we become judgy. That's when we look at other people and go, how can they call themselves a Christian? That's when we look at others and go, well, look what I've had to do to earn my place on the bus. That's what happens when we flip those two things around. But when we recognize that we could never do it on our own and that we need him, we live in a place of humility and of recognizing that it's not us, it's all him.